Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the absolute cornerstones of biblical history, the covenants God made with Israel through Moses. But here's a thought. What if the most famous one, the one everyone knows, wasn't the only one? We're about to explore the tale of two critical agreements, one at Horeb and another, much later, in Moab.
So let's start with this big question right here. Just imagine for a second. What if you were building a nation, not on some one-sided proclamation, but on a binding two-way contract? Well, that's exactly the idea at play. It's a mutual agreement with real responsibilities on both sides, and it sets the stage for an entire people's journey.
All right, first things first, let's get our terms straight. What do we even mean when we say covenant in this context? Because, as our source material makes very clear, we're talking about something way bigger than just a simple promise.
The key, and I mean the absolute key distinction here, is that this is a two-way contract. Actually, the original text uses a word ugavor, which translates literally to contract. So this wasn't some top-down decree. Nope, it was a structured agreement. The people had their own responsibilities to uphold to receive that divine blessing. It was, in effect, a roadmap for living.
Okay, so let's move on to the first, and definitely the most famous, of these contracts. The covenant made at Horeb. This is the one that laid that initial foundation for the nation of Israel, right after their dramatic exodus from Egypt.
Horeb is, of course, that legendary spot where Moses received the Ten Commandments. This moment is the bedrock of the entire relationship. It establishes the fundamental laws that are going to govern the people. It's really the moment the terms and conditions of the contract are first presented.
So, the crucial takeaway is that this Horeb covenant was the original deal. It was delivered to that first generation of Israelites, the ones who had just been liberated. It established the core principles and served as the essential guide for a people just learning how to be a nation.
But, and this is a big but, the story doesn't end there. Years later, when they're right on the verge of entering the Promised Land, a second covenant was made in a place called Moab. And this, it raises a really important question. If they already had a contract, why in the world did they need another one?
To understand why, you just have to look at their journey. There's a huge time gap between Horeb and Moab. We're talking a whole generation's worth of time spent wandering in the wilderness. The people standing in Moab were not the same people who stood at the foot of Mount Horeb.
And this is exactly why that second covenant was so necessary. The generation that received the law at Horeb was gone. Now it's their children, standing there, ready to begin a whole new chapter. They needed to personally hear, understand, and accept the terms of the divine contract for themselves before taking that huge step.
And this brings us right to the core idea of this whole explainer. Horeb wasn't replaced, it was supplemented. The first covenant at Horeb was the foundation the moment they received the law for the first time. The second one, in Moab, was a renewal of that very same commitment, but for the next generation, right before their new beginning. It wasn't a revision, it was a powerful reaffirmation.
So, we've talked about the what, the where, and the who. But let's really get to the why. What was the ultimate purpose of structuring this whole divine relationship as a detailed contract?
Well, the function was incredibly practical. It really worked in 3 steps. First, it established God's will with absolute clarity, no confusion. Second, it defined exactly what the people needed to do to uphold their end of the deal. And the result? By following the contract, they secured the promise of divine blessing. It was, just as the source says, a clear guide for a righteous life.
All right, let's wrap this up by looking at the lasting legacy of all this. Understanding this two-covenant structure, well, it gives us a much deeper insight into the nature of divine guidance as it's presented in these texts. This concept right here, from our source material, is so powerful. The laws weren't just a bunch of arbitrary rules. Instead, each and every commandment was seen as a direct expression of divine will and character. It was like a window into the mind of God, reflecting His desires for humanity.
So, let's just recap the biggest points here. There are 2 major covenants, not just one. Moab is the essential supplement to Horeb, not some replacement. Together they function as a practical guide for living, and, maybe most importantly,
They reveal a divine desire for a structured, unifying relationship. And that leaves us with one last thought to consider. This ancient model, a two-way contract between the divine and humanity, that is a really powerful idea. So the question is, how does this concept of a covenant continue to echo through our modern ideas of law, our pursuit of justice, and even our definitions of faith? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.